What's going on, guys? Welcome to part 6 of Hackintosh from start to finish. I hope you guys are enjoying the series. Now this video is going to be all about Windows, and that might sound kind of contradictory since this is a Hackintosh video. It's pretty much all about OS X. But this is going to be not only on how to dual boot with Windows 7, but also if you can avoid having to dual boot because it is sort of confusing. If you can avoid it, then there's a program which is, in my opinion, the best virtual machine out there. It's called Parallel 7. And this will actually let you run Windows right by OS X. So you'll be running them simultaneously, and you can interact with both Mac OS X and Windows 7 applications right next to each other using coherence mode and all that stuff. I'll get into it. But so first, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys some pros and some cons to using Parallels and to dual booting. Alright, so really quick, I'm going to list some pros to actually dual booting with Windows. Now the first off is obviously you get your system's full performance. When you use a virtual machine, you really can't use your system's full performance because it's running Mac OS X as well as Windows. Now you're running two things, whereas if you're just running one, then that one gets your full system's performance. So dual booting with Windows will let you reboot and actually have Windows, no virtual machines necessary, and you'll get your full system's performance. Now, just for running the occasional Windows app, this doesn't really matter, which is why I recommend dual booting. But if you're really into 3D, like hardcore video games, like you really want a game, or you really have like an intense application like a video editor that uses hyper-threading and you just really need that system performance, then virtual machine really is not the way to go because you won't unlock your system's full potential. So this is definitely a case where you'd want to dual boot. The next reason I have to dual boot is that it's just a lot less buggy. There are some applications that for whatever reason they just do not want to work on a virtual machine, but they'll work fine in an actual copy of Windows. Now I don't know the logic behind this, I don't know any specific applications off the top of my head, but I know it has happened to me before. So if you're a person that really needs to have a very stable install of Windows 7, maybe you use Windows for your job, and you have to have an application that'll work, then maybe you can try to use Parallels, but for something like that, I also recommend dual booting. And the last reason I have the dual boot is that you can use both displays on Windows. When you're running a virtual machine, you can full screen it, but you can only use one of your monitors. So if you want to have dual displays in Windows, then you have to dual boot. So now let's go the other way with this. Why would you want to have a virtual machine instead of actually dual booting? The first reason I can think of is that you don't have to restart. If you dual boot with Windows, you can't run OS X and Windows at the same time from different partitions on a hard drive. You just can't do it. But if you have a virtual machine, you can have OS X, for example, on this monitor, and you can have Windows on this monitor. Things like that. You can run both at the same time, and you don't have to restart to run Windows. So my next reason, and I've already sort of stated this, is that you can run Mac OS X and Windows applications simultaneously right next to each other. This is great for people like me. So for example, say I have Final Cut Pro open, I'm editing my video, and all of a sudden I have one that for whatever reason just will not import to Final Cut. I have to convert it first, but the only converter I have is a Windows-based converter. Problem solved. I can just boot right up into Parallels without having to restart. I can open up Windows, convert it, and then drag it right into Final Cut. Just like that, no problems at all. So it's very convenient if you need a quick access to a Windows app without wanting to have to reboot your computer, shut down everything, then this is a great alternative for you. The last reason I have to use Parallels is that you can use Windows in many different sorts of viewing modes. So for example, I could full screen Windows on this monitor and still have OS X on this monitor, or I could just have Windows within a window, no pun intended, that I could drag around my monitors. I'm free to move it wherever, or I could even use a mode called coherence. And what that allows me to do is to not have Windows shown at all. You pretty much have your start menu in your menu bar up there, so you just right click your menu bar and the start menu drops down. From there you can select an application and only that window will come up. You will not see a Windows desktop, you will only see the Windows applications. And they move around, they activate with mission control, everything just like Mac OS X applications. So now that you guys know the advantages of both, it's really up to you to decide, but it also helps you decide if you can get your hands on both of these. So if you just Google Parallels 7 or Parallels Desktop, then you can just get a free trial version. I'm not sure how long it'll last for, probably like a week or two, maybe even up to a month, but you can really just try it and see how you like it. Or you could just use the copy of Windows you have and just try out a dual boot. So I'm going to show you guys through Parallels as well as how to dual boot in this video. And the first thing I'm going to show you guys is the easier of the two, Parallels. So you can get your hands on this before you see if you want to dual boot or not. So with that said, let's just go ahead and jump into Parallels. And here we are at my desktop. So now let's have a closer look at the easiest way to run Windows on a Mac, or Hackintosh in this case, which is Parallels 7. Now I'll go ahead and come back here and I'll show the virtual machines list. Here you can have many virtual machines installed. You can create a new one. You can use Ubuntu, you can use Google Chrome. There's many different OSs you can install, including Windows Vista, Windows ME, Windows 98, etc., etc. So what I'm actually going to do now is just go ahead and fire up Windows 7. So before firing up Windows 7, I'm going to go ahead and just take you through my preferences. As you can see, it's called Windows 7. Now I have given this all of my 8 threads, so it will use all these, but you can restrict this. So if you only want to use, say, half of your machine, you can just give it 4. However, I use 8. It doesn't really matter, and it does give Windows some great performance. And I also have it using 4 of my 12 gigs of memory, so at any given time, the most that it could use is 4 gigabytes. You also have many options that you can change, such as backups, full screen, coherence. As also your hardware, you can tell the computer to use your network in a certain way. I don't have mine set up. I really haven't looked at it because I never had the need to use a network in Windows, so I'll just leave everything as it is. So now let's actually just go ahead and fire it up. As you guys can see, it automatically full screens it. So if I go to mission control, you can see it gave it its own space. So here we have Windows booting up. So as you can see, it boots very fast. And up here, all my 8 cores are recognized. It says I have a total of 4,095 megabytes, so 4 gigs of memory. And it's, like I said, it's all right next to my OS X. So I'll go ahead and I'll open an app here. Let's just do Windows Explorer. So you're free to move it around. It works very well, and I've actually come in here and I've run my test, the Windows Experience Index. And it got a great score, as you can see. 4 gigs of RAM. It does recognize my overclock, so it says 3.5 gigahertz. Tells you your CPU, and I have a 6 in my Windows Experience Index, which is a very nice score, especially for a virtual machine. So you can see the sort of performance that this would give you. Alright, so now coming out of full screen, you guys can see the next view, which is sort of just that little window, the effect that I was talking about earlier. I could resize this however I would like, and it'll automatically adjust. So I'm free to drag this around wherever I need to, but the mode I really want to show you guys is coherence. So I'm going to right click down here, go to view, and then enter coherence. And so as you can see, up in my menu bar, I now have the little Parallels logo. If I left click it, or like a regular click, you can see you have the devices menu. You can attach USB devices, your CD drive, your network. You also have access to the Windows Start menu, which you can also do by right-clicking this icon. So as you can see now, the Start menu comes down right from here, and you can navigate your computer as such. This is a very cool mode. So just to show you guys Windows and OS X apps running next to each other, I have iCal as well as Windows Explorer. And if I were to go into Mission Control, you can see it's organized as so. It's labeled as Parallels Desktop. I'm not sure if it'll actually show you the name of an app, but it works with Mission Control, as you guys can see. So this is a very efficient workflow if you need to have a Windows application for, like I said earlier, for work or for school. This is probably the best way to do it, hands down, because you can continue to use Mac OS X while you use your Windows applications. There's no need to reboot here. So I think by now you guys get the idea of Parallels and how efficient it is to use, how nice it is to use. So, but say this isn't really for you. You really want to have your system's full performance. So in this case, you'd have to dual boot. So now let's go ahead and have a look on how to dual boot. So the first step to dual booting is actually making a place to install Windows 2. So we're going to simply do this by opening up Disk Utility. And once Disk Utility is open, you want to come up here and click on the hard drive that you want to partition and come over to the Partition tab. Now yours will probably just have one partition here. As you can see, I have multiple. And so for the purpose of this video, since I already have one of these created, I'm going to go ahead and delete this partition. Alright, so now what you actually want to do is come up here and click on your partition and click this little plus sign. Now what this will actually do is create a partition for you with the amount of space that's left. So first off, you can name it whatever you'd like. I'm just going to name mine Windows. Now when you come up to the format, make sure that it's MS-DOS FAT. As you can see here, I do have a Windows NT file system, but that's because I have Paragon NTFS installed. If you don't have that installed, then you won't have these. And even though this is a FAT partition for now, it will be changed to NTFS when we go to install Windows, so don't worry about it. Just trust me here, it's MS-DOS FAT. And like I said, any name you want, any size you want, provided it fits on your hard drive, and click Apply. And this will actually create a FAT32 partition for us. And now that we have a place to put Windows, now you simply just want to put your Windows disk inside your computer and reboot. Before we go ahead and install Windows, I want to point out that this is a much easier process if you install Windows to a different hard drive than your Mac OS X installation. For example, my Mac OS X installation is on a 60 gigabyte solid state drive, and I'm going to be installing Windows to a separate 500 gigabyte hard drive. And the reason that this is easier is because you won't have to take an extra step after you install Windows. So right now you're probably sort of confused by this, and this is why I sort of recommend using parallels, because this can be sort of confusing, but I'm going to explain this to the best of my ability. So when you guys install a fresh copy of Windows, a few things happen. Number one, it installs its own bootloader. So as you guys know, Chimera is a bootloader, Chameleon is a bootloader, and it's required to boot OS X. However, if you install Windows on the same hard drive as OS X, Windows installs its own bootloader, which will overwrite that Chimera or Chameleon. And the reason that's bad is because the bootloader that Windows installs will not read OS X partitions. Now, what Windows also does is that it sets itself as the primary partition on that hard drive. So not only will the bootloader not recognize OS X partitions, Windows will just automatically boot without even asking you. So this is the most confusing part of dual booting with Windows 7. You'll have Mac OS X running perfectly on your computer, it's installed to the hard drive, you'll install Windows to a separate partition and you'll reboot, and all of a sudden you won't be able to get back into Mac OS X anymore. This is because of the bootloader. But this is where installing Windows to a second hard drive comes in handy, because in your BIOS, which I'll show you in just a second, as you can see we're in the BIOS, you can actually set a hard drive to be your default hard drive to boot from. So for example, if I set my 60GB solid state drive with Mac OS X on it as first in the boot priority, then no matter what, if I install Windows to another hard drive, that bootloader will not overwrite Chimera. Chimera will always come first, allowing me to boot into OS X and Windows. But moving back to the scenario where if you're installing Windows on the same hard drive as your Mac OS X, since the Windows bootloader will overwrite the Mac OS X bootloader, Chimera, what you have to do is after you install Windows, you're going to need that UniBeast flash drive or a different bootloader that you can use to boot into OS X. And after a successful installation of Windows, you're going to pop that bootloader in and then use that to boot into OS X. Once you're in OS X, you simply reinstall Chimera, and what that'll do is that'll slap the Windows bootloader right in the face and say, no, screw you, I come first. And from there, you'll be able to choose on startup whether you would like to boot OS X or Windows. So hopefully you guys understood that. That was my brief explanation. So now, if you do decide to install Windows to a separate hard drive, not just a separate partition, which I do recommend, installing Windows to a separate hard drive altogether, this is how you set your Mac OS X hard drive as your primary. For my motherboard, now it may be different on yours, you might have to find it depending on the motherboard you have, but mine is hidden in advanced BIOS features. And you can see the first object up there is hard disk boot priority. And as you can see, my OCZ Agility 3, which is my solid state, will come first. Now since that has Chimera installed to it, when I install Windows to this hard drive, that bootloader will come first on this hard drive, but since it's not booting from this hard drive first, Chimera will still come up in place of the Windows bootloader, allowing me to boot either OS X or Windows. Now say for example it was the other way around. Pretend that I was installing Windows to my solid state and Mac OS X to this hard drive. All I would simply do is move this first in my boot priority and then save my BIOS settings, and from then on my computer will automatically default to this partition to boot from. But since that's not the case, I'm going to go ahead and revert that by moving that back up, and now I'm all set. So I hope you guys understood that. And like I've said for probably around a third time now, I highly recommend installing Windows to a whole separate hard drive. So with that out of the way, let's just go ahead and install Windows. So before going on any farther, I just want to recap a few things that you'll need. First up, you're obviously going to need a USB keyboard and mouse. Once again, the Bluetooth Apple keyboard or whatever you have will not work. It has to be a USB or PS2. PS2 will probably work, but it's an outdated technology. You can buy a USB keyboard for very cheap nowadays. So I recommend USB, but PS2 should work if you have one. Next up, you're going to need a bootloader. I recommend UniBeast that we created in part 4. This is just by far the easiest method. You can use different bootloaders such as Chameleon or some other third-party ones, but you will need something that can boot you into your existing OS X installation. And the last thing you need is obviously the Windows DVD itself. So you really don't need too much for this, but it's the process that can sort of trick people. There's a little curveball in there. So I'm going to go ahead and restart my machine. And once you see your BIOS, I'm going to tell it to go to my boot devices. And once it comes up, I'm going to boot from CD. You basically just install a copy of Windows, like I'm sure most of you already know how to do, but in case you don't, this is a nice tutorial. But like I said, installing Windows is not the hard part. It's actually getting OS X to boot back up after Windows is installed. And as you can see, we have now booted up into the Windows 7 DVD. So this is just a very simple Windows 7 installation. Alright, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you guys can see this. So obviously you have to accept the terms. Click Next. And you have to do a custom install. And now you want to go ahead and find that Windows partition that we created. As you can see, mine's right here. And as you can see, I do have sort of a craziness going on here. I have a lot of different partitions. I recommend unplugging any hard drives that you're not going to use. This is just to be sure that you don't lose any data you don't want in case you mess up. So as you can see down here, it says Windows cannot be installed. That's because it's a FAT32 partition, so we have to format it as NTFS. So click that little dialog and click Format and hit OK. Alright, and once that's done, simply find that it's, as you can see, the Windows name is now gone, but it was disk 1 partition 4. I can also tell that because of the size I made it. As you can see, it's around 30 gigabytes. And also, like I said, if you unplug your hard drives, it will make finding this a lot easier to make sure you don't install it to the wrong partition. And as you can see down here, the only warning I'm getting is that it's recommended that I have more space, but that's no big deal. So just click Next. And this will probably take about 20 minutes or so I'll be back once this is done. Alright, so as you can see, my computer is about to reboot, and I want to stress something here. If you're like me, I'm installing Windows to a different hard drive than my boot partition is on for OS X. So that means that your boot priority in your BIOS has to be set to your OS X partition. So with that said, since that drive is being booted from first, you have to manually tell the computer to boot from the hard drive that your Windows installation is on. I'll go ahead and zoom out for you guys. So I went into my boot settings once my computer restarted from the Windows installation. And I have to stress this because if you try to go from Chimera into your Windows partition and complete the installation, then it will not work. You'll get a ton of errors, and it will just not work, and you'll have to restart, and it'll throw you for a huge loop. So actually what you have to do is boot from your other hard disk manually. So I'm going to go ahead and select hard disk, and you just have to know what hard drive it is. For me, this is the drive that right here that I'm going to boot from. This is my solid state, and this is my 1 terabyte backup drive. So I'm going to boot from this guy. And once you do that, it'll automatically go back into Windows. There will be no bootloader because it will just see the partition. So I have to stress that. Alright, so Windows is done installing. I don't have graphics drivers, but I barely use Windows as it is. But if I do, I can always set up my drivers later. I'm not too worried about it. And I have to say, holy crap, this was a 27.4 gigabyte partition, and there's 4 gigs left after a fresh install. This is the first time it rebooted since I installed the OS. Nothing has been installed. You're going to tell me that Windows takes 23 gigabytes of hard drive space just to install? OS X Lion takes about 6.5, so you put that into perspective, that's pretty crazy. Now if you installed this copy of Windows 7 to a separate hard drive other than your Mac OS X installation hard drive, and you've set your Mac OS X hard drive as the first in your boot priority, then you're done. Once you reboot, you'll go right back into Chimera, and you'll have the option to choose whether you want to boot into OS X or Windows. But for the rest of this Windows 7 dual boot tutorial, I'm going to assume that you guys installed Windows and OS X on the same hard drive. And if that's the case, then you're going to need your bootloader. So this is just a UniBeast flash drive that we've already created. So if you've installed both of your operating systems to the same hard drive, once you reboot, as I explained earlier, you're simply going to boot right back into Windows. You're not even going to have the choice to boot into OS X. So we're going to go ahead and fix that right now. So I'm going to go ahead and restart. And now while this is restarting, I'm going to go ahead and plug my UniBeast flash drive into my machine. Now keep in mind, if you're using like a DVD bootloader, then that is fine. And so once you see your BIOS screen, you want to go into your boot settings. Now like I said, if you're using a DVD, you'll just boot from DVD. However, since I'm using UniBeast, I'm going to go ahead and just boot from USB. And now once I boot from that USB, I will now get Chimera again. This is something that I would not get if I were to reboot without this UniBeast flash drive in. So now, as you can see, I have the choice to boot between UniBeast itself from the flash drive, that copy of Windows I just installed, or Hackintosh SSD. This is what you want to do. And so what we're going to be doing here once we boot into OS X again, is we're going to reinstall Chimera. And as I said earlier, just a sort of a recap, installing Chimera will overwrite the Windows bootloader and allow us to choose what OS we want to boot into again. So once you have OS X booted up again, you simply want to just continue right through MultiBeast. And you want to just come down to Chimera here, install that to Hackintosh SSD or whatever the name of your OS X partition is. Type your very secure password and let this install. Now, once it's done and you reboot, you'll actually have the option to choose what OS you guys want to boot into, whether it's Mac OS X or Windows. So just a quick recap of everything, I highly recommend that you install Windows to a whole separate hard drive. That makes the whole process much easier. You won't have to do this last little trick here at the end. But you can also do this if you only have one hard drive and you want to dual boot on that hard drive. It just takes an additional step, which can be confusing for some people. But if you have the hard drive space and the extra hard drive, I highly recommend you just install Windows to a whole separate hard drive. So this concludes part 6 of my Hackintosh from start to finish series. I hope this video helped you. Hopefully your Windows needs have been met, whether you decided to actually dual boot or go with just a software solution that is Parallels. They're both great solutions for all of your Windows needs. Be sure to check me out on Twitter. I'm at CPUKid. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, anything like that. Please take a second and click the like button. I really appreciate it. A lot of hard work goes into this video and this whole series really as a whole. So please give this video and all the rest, wouldn't hurt, a thumbs up for me. Be sure to check out the next video in the series, and this will probably be the last for a while because I really don't think I have much more that I could show you guys. I mean, with Windows and everything, it's really a complete system, but that's not to say that I won't update this series in the future and add more videos to it as more things come out, things change. Feel free to request something for this video series, and if I feel that enough people have the same question or that it's worth a video of its own, then I'll definitely take that into consideration and potentially just do a whole video to add onto the series about that topic. So like I said, watch out for the next video in the series coming at you in just a few days. That's just going to be some conclusive remarks. Alright, I've talked enough. I'll see you guys in part 7.